introducing a writer that you like really has to be one of life's better small pleasures. On my personal scale, this ranks somewhere near the pleasure of watching the chase scene in Wallace and Gromit's The Wrong Trousers. It's great, isn't it? Brief, but great. Or perhaps listening, even briefer, listening to Diana Krall sing the word constantly in the song You Call It Madness on her album All For You. The job of an introducer is to open the door and then step back out of the way, and I'll try to do that quickly. Charles Baxter is the author of a number of collections of short stories, and I don't have every book here with me. Through the Safety Net, there's one before that called Harmony of the World, and then after that comes A Relative Stranger, and then most recently Believers. And he's the author of 2 novels, First Light, a novel that goes backwards and is wonderfully fascinating to read, and Shadow Play, and then forthcoming this spring, a novel called The Feast of Love. Our friend and former colleague Darrell Spencer emailed me at the end of February, and we've been exchanging notes about, well, things like this and other things. And in his email, Darrell said, "I do admire Baxter's stories. He is some fine singing. The brain, he need a song." And Darrell's right, the brain, he need a song. I first started to read Charles Baxter in the summer of 1985 when I found a copy of Through the Safety Net at Olin Library at Cornell University. And I was dazzled and bewildered, puzzled, and satisfied by the final story in that collection, A Late Sunday Afternoon by the Huron, in which the narrator, who's been watching a whole bunch of people in a park spending Sunday afternoon, says, "What a relief it is, sometimes, not to have to tell a story about these people." It's a wonderful story that is about not telling a story, sort of. I don't even know how to describe it. Charles Baxter seems to me, when I think about it, among the writers of contemporary American fiction that I read pretty frequently and steadily, one of the most various. His forms, his subjects, seem to me to be a wider variety, say, than other writers that I admire intensely, like Frederick Bush or Andre Dubus. When I try to teach students about writing fiction, one of the things I always use, partly because it's in the writing fiction text I'm using, is the opening passage of his story, Griffin. I think it's hard to write good stories about school. This is a good one. And it begins this way, and I use this to teach students about details, about being concrete and specific. I'll give you the non-specific version and then the specific version. On Wednesday afternoon, our 4th grade teacher, Mr. Hibbler, developed a cough. Now this is the Charles Baxter version of this sentence. On Wednesday afternoon, between the geography lesson on ancient Egypt's hand-operated irrigation system and an art project that involved drawing a model city next to a mountain, our 4th grade teacher, Mr. Hibbler, developed a cough. This cough began with a series of muffled throat clearings and progressed to propulsive noises contained within Mr. Hibbler's closed mouth. "Listen to him," Carol Peterson whispered to me. "He's gonna blow up." Well, I'll stop there. You can see how tantalizing that is. Charles Baxter knows how to create, if you're willing to take it, narrative pleasure. And it's an immense pleasure to read his stories. I'm going to do you one more tiny excerpt and then I'll get out of the way. My pleasure will be over. My minor pleasure will be over and my major pleasure will begin. I think Charles Baxter is one of our great living American writers about domesticity. I know domesticity is thought to be dull and uninteresting, but in stories like the 3 stories about Saul and Patsy Bernstein, I find just wonderful things, and I'm not going to read the most wonderful thing. This is from the second of those three stories that I know of, at least, called Saul and Patsy Are Pregnant. And it begins with an automobile rollover, from which Saul and Patsy, fortunately for all of us, walk away alive. Here's Saul. He's just awakened Patsy. Come on, honey, he's waking her. Come on, honey, wake up, please, this is serious. I am awake. She blinked, twisted her head, then looked calm. Her opal earring glittered in the light of the dashboard. The earring made Saul think of stability and a possible future life, if only he would normalize himself. Patsy smiled. Saul thought that this smile had something to do with guardian angels who, judging from the evidence, flew invisibly around her head, beaming down benevolence. Well, she said, turning to look at him carefully, are you all right? Are you all right? It's about time to hear Charles. Let's do it.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you all very much for coming. I'm very grateful to be here, happy to be reading to you. Because Bruce mentioned the story Griffin, I thought that what I would do would be to read some excerpts from my work rather than one long story, so that what you'll be getting today is, to cite an old phrase, something old and something new. And I'll start with an excerpt from Griffin, which came out around 1985. My first job after I got out of college was teaching in the public schools. And I found when I was teaching, particularly towards spring, that sometimes your mind goes a bit blank, and it made me think of those times when I myself was in elementary school and we had substitute teachers. I always loved getting substitute teachers because they never knew what we were supposed to be doing, and we could get away with anything when they came in. And where I lived in Mound, Minnesota, rural Minnesota, there was one substitute teacher who was just a bit, I guess the word is unbalanced. And we always looked forward to having her come in. And she stuck in my mind, and a version of her is in this story, Griffin. It's narrated by a boy who's grown up and is talking about the 3 times that this teacher came in. And I'm going to read you a few paragraphs about her second visit to class. In her first visit to class, she has announced that 7 times 7 is 48, but only when she is in the room. Miss Ferenczi was back the next day, slightly altered. She had pulled her hair down and twisted it into pigtails, with red rubber bands holding them tight 1 inch from the ends. She was wearing a green blouse and a pink scarf, making her difficult to look at for a full class day. This time there was no pretense of doing a reading lesson or moving on to arithmetic. As soon as the bell rang, she simply began to talk. She talked for 40 minutes straight. There seemed to be less connection between her ideas, but the ideas themselves were, as the dictionary would say, fabulous. She said she had heard of a huge jewel in what she called the Antipodes that was so brilliant that when light shone into it from a certain angle, it would blind whoever was looking at its center. She said the biggest diamond in the world was cursed and had killed everybody who had ever owned it, and that by a trick of fate it was called the Hope Diamond. Diamonds are magic, she said, and this is why women wear them on their fingers, as a sign of the magic of womanhood. Men have strength, Miss Ferenczi said, but no true magic. That is why men fall in love with women, but women do not fall in love with men. George Washington had died because of a mistake he had made about a diamond. Washington was not the first true president, she said, but she didn't say who was. In some places in the world, she said, men and women still live in the trees and eat monkeys for breakfast. Their doctors are magicians. At the bottom of the sea are creatures as thin as pancakes who have never been studied by scientists because when you bring them up into the air, the fish explode. There was not a sound in the classroom except for Miss Ferenczi's voice and Donna DeShano's coughing. No one even went to the bathroom. Beethoven, she said, had not been deaf. It was a trick to make himself famous, and it worked. As she talked, Miss Ferenczi's pigtails swung back and forth. There are trees in the world, she said, that eat meat. Their leaves are sticky and close up on bugs like hands. She lifted her hands and brought them together, palm to palm. Venus, which most people think is the next closest planet to the sun, is not always closer, and besides, it is the planet of greatest mystery because of its thick cloud cover. I know what lies underneath those clouds, Miss Ferenczi said, and she waited. After the silence, she said, angels. Angels live under those clouds. She said that angels were not invisible to everyone and were, in fact, smarter than most people. They did not dress in robes, as was often claimed, but instead wore formal evening attire, as if they were about to attend a concert. Often, angels do attend concerts and sit in the aisles where, she said, most people pay no attention to them. She said that the most terrible angel had the shape of the Sphinx. There's no running away from that one, she said. She said that unquenchable fires burn just under the surface of the earth in Ohio. That's true. And that the baby Mozart fainted dead away in his cradle when he first heard the sound of a trumpet. She said that someone named Nazim al-Haradim was the greatest writer who had ever lived. She said that planets control behavior, and anyone conceived during a solar eclipse would be born with webbed feet. I know you children like to hear these things, she said, these secrets, and that's why I'm telling you all this. We nodded. It was better than doing comprehension questions for the readings in Broad Horizons. I will tell you one more story, she said, and then we will have to do arithmetic. She leaned over and her voice grew soft. There is no death, she said. You must never be afraid, never. That which is cannot die. It will change into different earthly and unearthly elements, but I know this as sure as I stand here in front of you, and I swear it. You must not be afraid. I have seen this truth with these eyes. I know it because in a dream, God kissed me here. And she pointed with her right index finger to the side of her head, below the mouth, where the vertical lines were carved into her skin. She has these two lines that go from her mouth down her chin, and it makes the narrator think of Pinocchio, makes her look like a puppet. Well, that's Miss Ferenczi. And now for something completely different. In Believers, my most recent book of stories, the very end of the story has to do with the narrator, a man named Jack Pelkey, visiting his father in an assisted care facility in Chicago. It's quite some distance up, and it looks out, if you know Chicago, at Lakeshore Drive and Lake Michigan. Now, Jack's father has had a stroke, The story is mostly about the father's visit to Germany in 1938, and his son has been trying to reconstruct this story. And in these visits, the son visits his father who's had a stroke and cannot speak. So it is the opposite of Miss Ferenczi. Miss Ferenczi says everything, and this father says nothing. And his son tries to communicate with him. My father lives several floors down from my mother's apartment. I like to visit him on the weekends, in the early morning, when the sun shines through his east windows, illuminating the floor, the cut flowers that are brought in and placed in a vase on the table opposite his bed. First, I go up to get my mother, where she lives in her apartment on the 7th floor. I bring her her mail, her new copies of The Nation and the Utne Reader. I give her a kiss, I give her my arm, and I escort her onto the elevator, and we go downstairs. She steps into my father's room, and then comes out in a few minutes. She tells me that she'll see me later. She's going to take a cab downtown for some shopping. Then I go in. My father suffered a stroke several years ago, a stroke followed by several others. And for 2 years now, he has been able to say nothing. One must converse with him through the eyes. He must be helped to perform most of his daily actions. But I love him. He is the only person on this earth whom I have loved with this intensity, even in his silence, even in his helplessness. And I am willing to be disabled by my love for him, no matter what it requires of me. Why should I apologize now for loving my father so enduringly? I stand in the doorway. I say, "Daddy, it's me." My father turns his face toward me. His face is fixed in an expression of rapture. He turns this expression toward me. I approach him where he sits. I sit down next to him. My father does not say anything to me now. He does not speak anymore, and I am not sure what he hears. Sometimes I read a word or two in his face, a word that escapes but is not spoken. I lean toward him. I kiss him on the cheek. My lips touch the bristly gray hairs where the nurses have shaved him carelessly. I tell him about my leak. In his head, the earth moves toward the sun and then away. Every so often, a bird alights on the sill outside his window, and his eyes turn toward it. For 2 years, he has had his sights set on something, but he cannot tell me what it is. Sometimes I help him up to his feet, and we limp together down the hallway, back and forth on what you might call a walk. I hold him up. We pass the silent others. I adjust myself to his limp. I limp with him, stride for stride, although those are not quite the words for what we do. Sometimes I hum songs to him. The rising of the sun, I sing. The running of the deer. The earth moves through the darkness of empty space as we do this. The morning passes. I lean forward, my ear toward his lips in case he has anything to say. On rare occasions, he seems almost able to pronounce a syllable. And once, when I was very tired, I thought I heard him say a word no louder than a whisper. The word was Hilfe. But I do not think I actually heard him say that word. I think I may just have imagined it. My father sits in utter silence, and it is there that I go to see him. At the end of my visit, I say, "Goodbye, Daddy," and I kiss him again before I go. My father has my heart in chains. I never know what time it is when I leave him. He follows me out of the room with his eyes. I think he loves me, as he did when we were younger, when I was a child in his house. I have 2 gifts, one for happiness and one for sorrow. Both of these gifts belong to my father and will be returned to him. One night my father rose from bed and wrapped himself in his bed sheets and stood facing the wall until they found him. Once I am outside the building where my father lives on the second floor, the floor where constant nursing care is required and received. 5 floors down from my mother, who lives on the 7th, I always stand and confront the sky and the sun, if it has not been hidden by clouds. And then I proceed down the sidewalk, where you would not particularly notice me. Slowly, step by step, I head down the block until you cannot see me anymore. I vanish into the crowd. Quite a change. I should have warned you about the word that the father says. His first language was German. As a boy, he's raised to speak German, and those of you who speak German may know that Hilfe means help. Checking the time. Now I'm going to, for another change of pace, read you something very new. This is from my new book, The Feast of Love, which is a sort of Midsummer Night's Dream, rewritten in the Midwest, if A Midsummer Night's Dream can be rewritten for that. And all of these chapters, it's a novel for voices. I see that what I'm doing today is reading to you, everything I've been reading to you is first person. Well, I guess I'm going to continue that, but all these speakers are very different. The idea in this is that somebody named Charles Baxter, the same as me, gets up in the middle of the night suffering from insomnia and walks down to a park in the middle of the night where people are jogging back and forth. My town, Ann Arbor, is full of insomniacs. People are jogging all night. It's a city that never sleeps. And there happens to be a friend of his named Bradley Smith who's there, and Bradley says, "You've got a writing block, huh? Can't get started on your new book? Well, listen, you want to write a book about love? I'll tell you about love. You just shut up and listen to me, and I'll tell you." So Bradley starts talking, and what he does is to tell this Charlie person about his marriage to a woman named Catherine. Actually, was divorced from her by the time this starts, but this is his story, and it's, I don't think there's anything else I have to tell you about it. But this is Bradley speaking. Every relationship has at least one really good day. What I mean is, no matter how sour things go, there's always that day. That day is always in your possession. That's the day you remember. You get old and you think, well, at least I had that day. It happened once. You think all the variables just might line up again. But they don't, not always. I once talked to a woman who said, yeah, that was the day we had the angel around. I don't think that Catherine and I had been married more than about 2 months when this event I'm about to describe occurred. About 5 years ago, we were living in a little basement apartment, and we were both working 2 jobs. She had a part-time job at the library during the day, and she was waiting tables at night. I was the day manager at a coffee shop, not the place where I am now, and getting headaches from the overhead lighting, and I was also doing some house painting, but it was late autumn and the work came in fits and starts. Catherine was strong and spirited. She once even threw a chair at me. But she had one fear. She was profoundly afraid of dogs. And not because she had ever been bitten. She claimed she hadn't been bitten. No, it was just when she saw one of these animals on or off a leash walking toward her, the hair on the back of her neck stood up, what you would call primal terror. She had no idea of the source of this fear. She just wanted to run away. I once saw her gallop down a hill in the park to escape a dog, a German Shepherd puppy that had trotted up to her, its tail wagging for a head pat. When I caught up to her, she was crying. "I don't ever want to come back here," she said. "I can't bear it." "It was a puppy, Catherine," I told her. "I don't care what it was. None of that matters," she said. I had my arms around her, But then she turned so that she broke free of my embrace. She ran back to our car and locked herself inside, and I had to beg her to let me in. Man, I had to beg. And I ain't too proud to beg either. She had her hair pinned up, but in her panic it had fallen down around her face, little tendrils, and her face was blotched with her crying. You know, I hate to say it, but she was gorgeous like that, and I would have loved to have helped her. You need to do something for people when they get terrorized, when they get terrified. But terror is usually so vague, you can't talk it out of anybody. What are you going to do when it doesn't matter what you say? But it's a funny thing about other people's phobias. When you don't share them, you sort of pick at them like a scab. You want to remove them. So, on this day I'm telling you about, we were both free of our jobs, Catherine and I, one of those late autumn Midwestern Sundays with a few golden leaves still attached to the trees. You know, last remnants, leaves soaked with cold rain, sticking to the car windshield, or clinging to the branches they came from. She woke up, and we made love, and I said, I'll make you breakfast, and I did, my specialty, scrambled eggs and onions and hot sauce. And then I made coffee while she sat at the table smiling with her legs tucked under her. That was something she did. She sat in chairs with her legs tucked under her. We lazed around and read the Sunday paper, and I massaged her neck, and then she said, I want to go somewhere. Bradley, take me somewhere today, please. So I said, okay, sure. We got dressed for the second or third time that day, and we cleared off the pizza boxes from the front seat of my car. Do you remember it, that old Ford Escort? The one with the bad clutch? And we drove off. By this time it was about noon, maybe a bit after that. Without considering what I was doing, I found myself driving up toward the Humane Society. And I thought, the Humane Society? No, I really shouldn't be doing this. But I kept driving because I was distracted by the leaves and by a knocking sound from the engine, which turned out to be the lifters, though I only discovered that later. Excuse me, but where are we going? She asked. Up there, I said in my secretive way. I did have those kennels and cages in mind, but I thought I should just keep quiet about it. You can't tell some women everything. You just can't. Once we arrived, we parked in the lot close to this animal bunker that the Humane Society is housed in, and you could hear the barking echoing off the walls and the trees. A deaf person could hear it. It's constant and unrelenting. When they're in that condition, dogs have a kind of yowl that's close to human, and it makes your body grip up. Your nerves get restless and uneasy listening to dogs crying out, carrying on. The old alarms seep into your bones, right into the marrow, where fear is lodged. And what I did in the car was I sneezed. And Catherine watched me sneeze without saying anything. No, Gesundheit, no, God bless you, no, nothing. She just let me sneeze. Then she waited some more, and I waited too. Is this what I think it is? She asked. Is this your great idea of where to take me on Sunday afternoon, our day off? Because the thing is, I'm not going in there. Catherine, I said, it's the Humane Society. They're in cages. No, Bradley, she said, I won't. You probably mean well, probably. I'll give you credit, but I'm not going in there. I'll hold you, I said. Hold me? Honey, I'll hold you around the shoulders. And I have an idea, Catherine. I have an idea about what you should do when you get inside. I don't care what your idea is. I know it. I know you don't care, but let's try. Come on, honey, I said, and I took her hand for a moment. After we got out of the car, I could tell she was terrified because her knees were shaking. Have you ever seen a woman's knees in a spasm from fear? It's not a sight that lifts you up. In the anteroom, which I remember because the floor was covered with green mottled linoleum and also because the air was fragrant with a mixture of Lysol and Mr. Clean, The receptionist asked us what we were there for, and I said that, well, we, that is Catherine and I, thought it was a little early to start a child, but maybe we could manage a dog. We were contemplating adopting a dog, I said, and Catherine made a little sound, a sort of glottal grunt of apprehension or a groan, but quietly so that only I heard it. Guttural. And the receptionist, this young red-haired woman in a yellow jumpsuit, said, well, it's fortunate for you that these are visiting hours, so you can just go through that wall there and then turn to the left and proceed down the hallway and you'll see them, the dogs, I mean, because they'll be on both sides. And if you want anything, you just come back and let me know. So I put my right arm around Catherine's shoulders and we went in through that door and down the hallway. It wasn't very well lit. Bare bulbs screwed into the ceiling showered raw light downward, so the place looked like an aging army barracks. I don't know what I was expecting. The floors were cement, so they could clean them easily of waste matter, and our shoes, our running shoes, were squeaking on that surface. You can't imagine the noise. They were all barking and howling and yapping, these dogs of every size, pure dog desperation, mutt, mania, an army of refugee dogs, and we marched down that hallway between the cages being roared at, like these dogs were screaming, save us, and I held on to Catherine, and then we walked back with me still holding on, and then we walked down the hallway a third time, and Catherine said, you can let go of me. So I did. I let go of her. We kept walking back and forth. We weren't about to get a dog. No, that wasn't the idea, despite what I had said. We were just there, walking up and down that aisle at the Humane Society for Catherine's benefit, and after about the fifth time, it felt as if we were on inspection in the dog barracks. Not all the dogs quieted down, but some of them did, and when they did, we began to peer at them, which we hadn't really done when we were making a racket and they were just generic dogs. It's when you start looking at dogs that you notice their faces. Is that the word? Faces, muzzles. And after all, in a humane society, they're mostly just mutts. So you don't have anything like a breed to distract you except for the Dalmatians, because people are always buying Dalmatians, thinking that they're cute, and then they get rid of them, because they can't stand how difficult and how dumb they are. You do notice all the Dalmatians in the Humane Society. Catherine was a bit scared, but by this time she was noticing their expressions. I didn't prompt her, I didn't say anything. And soon she said, I'll bet that one likes a party. And I'll bet that one's a bully. That one's kind of stupid, but has a good sense of humor. That one, he's a recluse. That one's a pack animal. That one there, she's stubborn and independent. That one likes to ride in cars. That one thinks all day about food. She had her index finger pointed at them, and then she started to name them. You're Otis. You're Sophie. You're Lester. You're Duffy. You're Gordon. You're Daisy. You're Waverly. And you handsome fellow, she said, pointing down at a dog on the other side of the bars, you're Bradley. There was a dog there, I admit it, that looked a lot like me. Like my brother or cousin, these sorts of eyes I have. And its voice was just like mine, rumble, phlegmy, you know, but strong and commanding, the way my voice is. Brownish fur like mine too, and friendly like me, but prone to harmless manias, also like me, you could just tell. And the thing was, as Catherine was doing this, something quite amazing happened. One by one, the dogs stopped barking. They just quit. At first, I didn't think it was happening. I thought it had to do with my hearing. You know, what do they call it, tinnitus? But it wasn't that. The dogs were really going quiet. Catherine would point at them one at a time, at one dog, give it a name, you're Inez, and the dog would look up at her, And after a moment or two, Inez the dog, would clam up. And before very long, it grew really quiet in there, maybe a yip or two now and then, but otherwise no sound. As if all that time, all they had wanted was a name. It was spooky. "I think we'd better leave now," Catherine said. I took her hand and we went back to the car. But before we got to the car, the red-haired receptionist in the jumpsuit said, "What happened? What did you do in there?" And she went rushing back toward the kennels, and the dog started howling again, crying out as we unlocked the car and backed out of the parking lot and pulled out into the road. We were gone. We were erased from the Humane Society. Meanwhile, the sky had mottled over with clouds, nervous scuds of cloud matter. We lived in a cheap place in one of those student neighborhoods, an old building, really antiquated. One cigarette would have set it afire instantly. I was driving, rushing back to our old building in that apartment, feeling gleeful. And at first Catherine was annoyed that I had taken her there to see the dogs, you know, paternalistic or patriarchal or something equally criminal. But then she changed her mind, and in her excitement was actually bouncing on the seat, her legs tucked under her, and she said, "I'm still scared of them, but Brad, I was inspired. Those were really their names. I gave them the right names. I knew exactly what to call them." "There's no such thing as the right name for a dog," I said. "It's all arbitrary. Any name is arbitrary." "No, it isn't," she said. "There are okay names, there are approximate names, but there's one correct one, and I hit it every time." And I thought, well, I don't know, who cares? Maybe she's right. Why argue? We got home and we sat down on the sofa together, and she looked so beautiful in her blue sweatshirt and the blue jeans she was wearing, no socks, just sneakers. These rags, these gorgeous rags that she had made beautiful by wearing them, and the cap she had on and her gray eyes, the delicate way she moved, and in a sudden heedless rush I said, "Catherine, I love you," and she nodded, she acknowledged it. She didn't say she loved me, but I didn't care, and I didn't even notice. On that day, she leaned into me. We held on to each other, clutching. We must have stayed together in one posture, just holding each other there on the sofa for maybe an hour. When you're in love, you don't have to do anything. You can just be. You can just stay quiet in the world. You don't have to move an inch. Then eventually she said, "Look, it's snowing." We disentangled ourselves and got up together and walked over to the window. The air had been abruptly filled, every square inch, with snowflakes, and I thought how peaceful it was, even though the snow was just this humble artifact. "This is our first snow," I said aloud, thinking that we would have many more years of seeing it together, that we would stand in front of windows year after year, watching the first snow, the two of us, watching the wind swirl it, watching the spring storms, watching the snow melting and the water rushing into the drains. From now and onward into forever, this would happen. We would watch our children playing in the melting snow, splashing in the puddles. After we died, we would still be seeing everything together, Catherine and me, into eternity, I thought. Death would be a trivial event as long as I loved her. She must have thought she loved me too, because she wanted to cook a dinner for me, which she did, a quick stroganoff. And then afterward, while I was doing the dishes, she was still sitting at the table and she started to sing. I had never heard her sing before. I didn't know she could sing. I don't think she knew that she could sing. She had a small, very small, but a sweet voice, and in this small, sweet voice she sang two songs, I guess the only ones she could think of at that moment, very slow and sultry, "You Are My Sunshine" and "Stairway to Heaven." Then in bed later she sang the Michigan fight song, "Hail to the Victors," softly and slowed down in my ear. As a love song, you know, the way you'd sing to a winner, because after all, I had won her somehow. Outside, the snow went on falling. For days afterwards, I went back secretly to the Humane Society. I went back there and gazed at the dogs in their pens. I would look at all the dogs that Catherine had named. Also, I was looking for the Labrador Retriever Collie mix she had named Bradley, after me. Finally, I went in and said I wanted him, and they turned him over to me, but only after they had neutered him and given him his shots. I persuaded my sister Agatha and her husband Harold to keep him for a while until I had convinced Catherine about the wisdom of having a dog named Bradley. I just knew I could talk her into it. I took Bradley up north, wagging and slobbering in the back seat, and left him with Agatha. Back at the Humane Society, week after week, the other dogs were gone. One by one, they disappeared, replaced by new dogs. The old dogs, the dogs Catherine had named, had found homes, I liked to think, where they were fed and housed and taken care of, but where they were occasionally unhappy about one thing, which was that they had the wrong names. The name they were supposed to have had been lost, and their owners had given them bogus names, childish names, lousy, standard issue dog names like Buster, and Rover, and Rex. The only dog who had the right name was Bradley, a name that he and I had to share. Once in a while I would see a dog out on the street and I would recognize it from the Humane Society, and I knew it had seen us, Catherine and me, two people in love, walking up and down between the cages holding each other. It had seen that but didn't or couldn't remember I was the person who remembered. Now there's Bradley the person, me, and Bradley the dog, him. You know, that day was perfect. A breath of sweetness. That's a phrase I would never use in real life, but I just used it. You can laugh at my wording if you want to. You can laugh at the names I have for things. I know you do that. But I'll think of that day from now on as a perfect day, a breath of sweetness. What I'm saying is, that day was here, and then it was gone, but I remember it. So it exists here somewhere, and somewhere all those events are still happening and still going on forever. I believe that. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, and then later this afternoon, someone tell me what room number?
1081.
1081 at 4 o'clock. We will have more questions and answers if we don't have the time enough for all of yours right now. Immediately afterward, we'll have these books for sale and refreshments in the room right next door. Questions?
The books make excellent gifts. If you have any questions, you're happy. Feel free to ask anything. Don't worry, anything at all is fine. Yes?
I have read Burning Down the House and really like it. What are some of the differences between composing nonfiction like that and writing a short story?
Well, in some ways, I think they're not all that different. When you write a story, you're trying to tell a story and you're encountering certain difficulties. Either there's something you don't know how to do, or something you have to figure out how to do, and you're trying through experimental means to discover it. The essays in Burning Down the House are largely a result of stories of mine or novels of mine that misfired. And I learned from my own failures. I feel as if I'm in the Slow Learners Club. I wrote 3 novels that were never published. And it took something like 5 years out of my life. And I mean, there are things such as discovering that a story that I had created was not going anywhere, and one of the reasons it wasn't going anywhere was that I had concentrated too hard on one character. and that in order to get something happening on the page, I really needed some counterpoint. This character only becomes interesting when you put this character next to her. And so there's an essay in that book called Counterpointed Characterization, which is about learning to make your stories lively by introducing an extra character sometimes who brings out something interesting from the character whom you're concentrating on. I mean, in the last chapter that I read to you, Bradley brings out something interesting, I hope, from Catherine by forcing her to go to a place that she would never go to on her own. And I just don't think that scene would be the same thing if Catherine went, I mean, first of all, she wouldn't go to the Humane Society by herself. But secondly, it's more interesting if there are two people there. So, I mean, those essays came from that. It's mostly a matter of sort of reporting on the experiments that you've made. And also, my own students face various kinds of difficulties, and I try to think through things with them, and sometimes the chapters, the essays follow from that. I like writing both, but I like writing fiction better.
I'm interested in the last piece and in all of your pieces. It seems like we're walking with you along the edge of possibility.
Mm-hmm.
All the dogs becoming silent and recognizing these dogs later. I don't really have a question. I'm interested in hearing you talk about that kind of walk on the edge of possibility.
Well, it's a beautiful question, and I must tell you that when I wrote that chapter, I thought, nobody's going to buy this. This is utterly implausible. Anybody who's ever been in a humane society knows none of this would ever happen. It won't happen. You could send two people into a humane society and send them up and down the aisles between the dogs. They're not going to grow quiet. It won't happen. So, I mean, what I'm doing is taking your question about the edge of possibility, and what I would argue is that when you write stories, you have a certain latitude in what I would call plausibility, and at one end of the extreme, you move toward what I would call the art of wonder, where the reader is in a state of wonderment, and you think, wow, maybe that could happen. Maybe there's a possibility that this could happen. And I think some of the most interesting fiction takes chances in bringing to the reader things that might be, should be, could be true. And I'm always trying to push my imagination a little bit towards something that would grip the reader's attention and leave an image in your head because of the way that it might be true. So you move toward the edge of possibility there. You move toward the edge of possibility with someone like Miss Ferenczi in her 4th grade class. I mean, if you put a woman like that into an elementary school, I think she'd be fired pretty fast. Although in rural Michigan, where I taught, nobody would notice. I don't think anybody would notice, but you take those kinds of incongruities, those things in your life that you saw happen and which you think, wow, think of that, think of what I saw, and you push it a little bit in your stories, and that's what people will pay attention to, or it's my hope that's what they'll pay attention to. Good question.
We'll have time for more questions at 4 o'clock. Please come next door for some refreshments.